I'm here with author Mike Campbell for the second part of our conversation about Amelia Earhart. Campbell is the author of Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last, the second edition of which was released in 2016. And you can also read his blog at earharttruth.com, where he writes about the Amelia Earhart disappearance. And the blog is an amazing source of information with lots of great photos. Definitely would suggest you check it out. In the last episode, we covered a lot of the different aspects of Mr. Campbell's work, including the different sets of witnesses that lead him to believe that Earhart ended up on Saipan. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about some of the other ideas that are out there about what became of Amelia Earhart. And we're also going to be talking about recent media that's been published about Earhart, including a recent history documentary. So I guess we're going to start by briefly going back over some of the material that we talked about in the first part of our conversation. And Mike, where would you like to start? Should we lay a foundation in terms of who Miss Earhart was, or maybe we could just have you talk a little bit about a brief overview of your theory?
Okay, Leo, thanks. Good to be back with you. We're just continuing, basically. In the first hour, we talked about Saipan, and we talked about a little bit about the Marshall Islands, and, I think it's good just to bring everybody up to date on the big picture, what really happened, okay? What really happened is this. On July 2nd, 1937, Amelia, after about 20 hours of flight, radioed her seventh and last message to Itasca at about 8:44 a.m. local time, Howland Island time. Her last message was basically, we're on line of position 157, 337. We're running north and south. Wait listening on 6210. We'll broadcast on the half hour. Something like this is what her last message was. And that was it. She was never heard from again. Very strange. Her transmissions during her last several hours, she was never on the air with the Itasca more than 10 seconds at a time. She was acting as if she did not want to be traced, as if she didn't really want to find Howland Island at all. One of the radio men on board the Itasca, his name was Bill Galton. He was a third-class radio man, told researcher Paul Rafford, I'm not sure when he told him this, I think it was sometime in the 80s, the early 80s, but he told Rafford that Paul, that woman did not want to, never attended on reaching Howland Island. This is what Galton told him, and in her behavior tells us that. We don't need to go through all those details, but she went missing under very strange circumstances. There was no clue as to what really happened, okay? No Mayday, no nothing. She just went off the air, and she said she was running north and south. Nobody's been able to tell me what running north and south means either, okay, at all. So she goes missing, and there's a big naval search. They don't find anything. They look for 262,000 square miles in the middle of the Pacific, but they don't search the Marshalls. In fact, she landed at Mille Atoll in the Marshall Islands. She was picked up at Mille Atoll, we think, by a Japanese fishing boat. We even have a headline from a newspaper in the United States that was taken from the story that was actually reportedly run and published in a Japanese newspaper briefly until the government got involved and made sure that story got taken down. Okay, so she got picked up by a Japanese fishing boat, and then she was taken to the Koshu, somewhere along the line, somewhere out there at Mille. The Koshu took Earhart and Noonan aboard. They also took the Electra aboard, probably on the stern of the ship. It was this Japanese survey ship. And the Koshu then was ordered there on the 13th, I believe, of July, and then shortly thereafter showed up at Jalowit, which was the nearest atoll to Mille that had facilities. Jalowit was the Japanese headquarters in the Marshalls at the time. They were building up their facilities there, and they had a hospital, and they had, and at Jalowit, Bilimon Amaron, the Japanese hospital corpsman, went out, took care of Noonan's knee, also reported that Noonan had a head injury with a white bandage, and so forth. So from Jalowit, they were taken to Kwajalein. Kwajalein, there were several witnesses that saw them. Later on, Marines discovered some of her stuff on Kwajalein. From Kwajalein, they were taken to Saipan, we think via seaplane, where they were seen at some point in the summer of 1937 by Josephine Blanco Akiyama. In the summer of 1937, we don't have a date, but she saw them then, and then later reported seeing them to Dr. Casimir Sheff, the Navy dentist, in the late 40s, or somewhere around 46 or 7, I believe. She told Casimir Sheff about what she had experienced. Later on, Sheff told this information to Paul Briand Jr., the Air Force Academy English teacher who was writing a biography of Earhart, and Briand included all this information in his final closing chapter in Daughter of the Sky, the 1960 book that broke the story of Earhart being seen on Saipan by Josephine Blanco Akiyama. That began the modern-day search for Earhart. Fred Gurner soon got involved with this after seeing the stories in the San Mateo Times by Linwood Day. And Gurner made the first of his 4 trips to Saipan, supported by CBS. Gurner was a CBS radio newsman. On July 15th or June 15th, 1960, Gurner showed up at Saipan for the first of his 4 trips. Later on, in 1966, the results of his investigations on Saipan were published in the best-selling book, The Search for Amelia Earhart. That's the big picture, the foundational look at what happened to to Amelia Earhart. Gurner's book presented about 5% of what we've learned since 1966. Gurner continued his research after his book was published, said that he was going to publish another book but never got around to it. But many other not many, but several other researchers, including Thomas Devine, Vincent V. Loomis, Oliver Knaggs, Bill Primack, to name some of the more prominent and notable researchers, did much work and have filled in many of the blanks. This is not in my mind, we have only the truth about what happened to Amelia Earhart, and it is no mystery. We know that the United States government is very well aware of what happened to her. So much evidence, mountains of evidence show that she was in the Marshalls and everything that I've just indicated, taken to Saipan. So there is no Earhart mystery. When I do presentations with groups in person, that's the first thing I say. There is no such thing as an Earhart mystery. This is a lie that's been propagated for 80 years. These so-called theories, these other ideas that we're going to get to shortly, are not theories at all, because theories have to have some sort of scientific hook on which to be hung. There must be something that resembles information that's credible and legitimate, and that would possibly reflect or give us an alternative answer. In the other 2 theories, the crashed-and-sank theory and the Nikumaroro theory, which are the 2 most prominent, neither one of those theories actually give us any of those things. And when they are scrutinized closely, they dissolve into thin air. They become smoke. Therefore, I call them lies that have been glorified to the status of theories. Okay, so that's Leo. That's basically what where we are, and
yeah. The armature of those other theories is really spare. There's not a whole lot to hang on, as you said, and we'll be exploring a little bit more about what makes up those, because I think it's important to at least talk about why the media only covers those, and there's a lot of commonality with this case and a lot of the other cases that we explore in this podcast, in that the media isn't giving you the whole picture. And I think that one of the interesting things that we're going to explore with Earhart in this case is an example of a case that's been sitting out there for over 80 years now, And there's still no consensus in the mainstream about what happened, even though there's a lot of evidence that's contained in your book that makes it clear that there is actually a pretty strong narrative in terms of what became of Amelia Earhart. And so I think one of the first places we might start is just talking about the crashed and sank hypothesis, which was for many years the official line on the Earhart story. Just that she crashed into the ocean and disappeared and nothing was ever found of her. And as you mentioned briefly in that opening, there was a large search expedition undertaken after she disappeared, correct? And they never found any sign of her. That is sort of how it went down, is it not?
Yes. Okay. We had the Itasca immediately went on a search to the northwest of Howland Island, searching about 120 miles, because that's where all the cloud cover was at the time. And so the Itasca searched northwest of the island immediately. Then I think on the 7th, the 7th of July of 1937, the Colorado made it down there. The battleship Colorado made it down there to the Howland Island area. And it had 3 search planes that it launched, and they searched the Phoenix Islands. The Phoenix Islands being where Nikumaroro is. And they found nothing. And then the USS Lexington, the carrier, the aircraft carrier, with 63 planes aboard, showed up on July 11th, I believe, and they searched with their battle group. And altogether they searched 262,000 square miles, and they found nothing. And it's not just the Navy report, the Navy and the Coast Guard, they all filed separate reports. The Colorado did, the Lexington did, and the Itasca did. They also filed separate reports, but they were all the same basic report. We didn't find anything, and they all basically agreed that their best guess was that best estimate was that the Electra crashed and sank on the ocean 120 miles northwest of Howland Island. That was basically the Navy verdict, and that was the official verdict, and that is still the official verdict. If you listen to anybody in the media or in the establishment, they will tell you that's the official verdict. They won't tell you anything, though, about the O&I report, which we talked about briefly in the first hour. The O&I report being the report of Thomas Devine's account, and that's an official government document as well.
That was declassified in like 1967 or thereabouts?
Yes, it was declassified in 1967. It was done in 1960, and it was considerably different in 1967 than was seen in 1963 by Thomas Devine and Fred Noonan. They both saw copies of it in 1963. The 1967 version, according to Devine, was different in some major respects. They had to tone down some of the lies because they just weren't believable. But the basic verdict of the premise of the 1967 report wouldn't have been necessary to even do it if the original verdict was so. If the plane actually crashed in the sea and sank 120 miles northwest of Howland, why are they doing an investigation on Saipan for Amelia Earhart in 1960? This report is the closest thing actually that we have to a smoking gun in the Earhart case, because of its very existence and because of some of the things that they say in there. I don't want to. This is all. Anyone that's listening to your podcast can go to my blog, do a search on O&I report, and read all about it. And so there's no point in getting into all the details of that. What we want to talk about now are the 2 big lies, which are called theories. The first is the crash and sank, and which is based on the original Navy report. Now, the Bible, the famous book, the famous progenitor of the crash and sank theory is a guy named Elgin Long, who was a famous aviator in his own right, set some world records, I think back in I'm not real sure. I think back around 1970 or something like this. He was the first man to circumnavigate the globe at the poles, from one pole to the other pole, among other things that he accomplished as a navigator. As a navigator, or as an aviator. As an aviator, Elgin Long was fine, but as a theorist in the Earhart case, he was woefully lacking, and obviously a government shill, obviously a government spokesperson in every way, shape, and form. His book called Amelia Earhart, The Mystery Solved, is anything but the mystery solved. And in his book, everything in his book is basically he's trying to get her to run out of gas before she gets to Howland Island. And all his statements and all his calculations are based on false assumptions, based on assumptions about wind headings and headwinds and fuel capacities that are all messed up. A researcher named Roland Reineck analyzed some of his statements and for the Amelia Earhart Society newsletter, and online they used to have a forum there where ideas were exchanged. And Reineck pretty well took care of Long's ideas. We know that she didn't run out of gas before she got to Howland Island. She might have run out of gas at Millie Atoll, but if she did, it wasn't because she was trying to reach Howland Island. She could possibly have run out of gas if she overflew truck and then took the long way down to Howland. Yes, that's what might have happened, but Long doesn't figure that happened at all. He doesn't even begin to theorize that she might have been overflying truck, as many believe is likely. We don't know for sure, but it's likely that she might have been doing that for FDR to see what was going on at truck. So the idea that she crashed and sank in the ocean became pretty laughable among Earhart researchers and even the general public by the late 80s. By then, it just wasn't acceptable anymore, especially when you consider so many people were beginning to hear about Gardner's work and about Vincent V. Loomis's work in the mid-'80s in the Marshalls, and then Thomas Devine's book came out. I mean, Crashed and Sank compared to all this overwhelming amount of information that was being amassed by these researchers. It just didn't stand up at all. So they had to come up with something else, because I don't know how much we talked about it in the first hour, but this is all about the reason I'm sitting here talking to you, and I did my book, and Devine did his book, and that any of this has been necessary is because the legacy of FDR could never stand the heat or the knowledge, the official knowledge, public disclosure that FDR did not help Amelia Earhart in 1937 when she was held by the Japanese. That's what this has always been about, and that's what this will continue to be about. People that deny that say it happened a long time ago and that it's no longer important, that's complete nonsense and rubbish. All the history books would have to be rewritten in light of Roosevelt's knowledge of the Japanese having Amelia Earhart. This is way too big to ever be acknowledged this long after the fact. It was covered up then, and it continues to be denied and covered up as best possible by the establishment. That's what this is all about, okay? Yeah. So, by the late 1980s, Crashed and Sank was too ridiculous for words. They had to come up with something new. And so what they came up with was what they called the Nikumaroro hypothesis. Now, the Nikumaroro hypothesis is really not such an hypothesis at all, but it is actually the original Mccain-Gardner-landing theory that was created by an inventor named Fred Noonan, who worked very closely with Fred Gardner in the 1960s, in the late 1960s. From then on, after Gardner's book was published, Hooven met Gardner through correspondence, and they became close. Hooven was a famous inventor, and he looked at all the information that was available about alleged signals coming out of the Pacific at the time of the Earhart disappearance. And he had all these different things. Navy stations had all these alleged signals that might have come from Amelia. And Hooven did all this analysis, and he came up with what he called the Mccain-Gardner-landing theory, that's what TIGHAR, the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, and Ric Gillespie, their chief executive. That's really what this is. That's really what the Nikumaroro hypothesis is. It's just a glorified version of Hooven's original Mccain-Gardner landing theory. But Gillespie has never publicly credited Hooven with this. Not only that, he's never ever publicly credited. He's acted as if he discovered this himself. However, I will grant on his website, on the TIGHAR website, you can find Hooven's original work. It was presented in 1982 at the Smithsonian Museum. There was an air and space, or there was a some sort of an Earhart. I forget the word, but there was an event there where,
like a symposium.
Hooven, yes, right, the symposium that Hooven presented his book, his paper, Amelia Earhart's Last Flight, I believe was the name of his paper, and that was the initial introduction of the Mccain-Gardner landing theory to the public in 1982. Okay, soon after that, though, Hooven rejected that theory and recanted it. He died in 1985. Shortly before he died, many researchers have informed me that he did take it back, and so has Gardner said the same thing. After looking at it more closely, after examining all the factors involved, such as all the people that lived there on Nikumaroro, which was originally Gardner Island, and considering all the different factors, Hooven recanted the theory and said, no, this could not have happened. Gillespie, of course, has never referred to that, has never even acknowledged that Hooven existed, much less recanted the theory. So
it definitely has, a lot of similarities with other long-standing controversies like this, in that it's almost like a modified limited hangout or something like that, where there's something else that was in the aether, like the Gardner hypothesis. And once other stuff, as you mentioned, in the 80s started to come out, that made it seem less and less likely, and the state of knowledge was such that it was basically ridiculous. Then another highly funded group came out of nowhere, TIGHAR, as you've mentioned, to promulgate this new theory. And I think that's one of the interesting things about TIGHAR, is that when they came on the scene, they certainly had an imprimatur from the press and from the establishment, in that, for example, one of their first major press conferences was held at the National Press Club in the early 90s. Maybe we could get a little bit more into what TIGHAR is all about. And
yeah, right. Yeah, they were. Their big splash was in 1990. I'm not sure of the date. It was March of 1990, I believe, and it was covered on CNN, and it was nationally televised. And Gillespie said that they had solved the Earhart mystery based on at the time was the Navigator's bookcase. They've now been to Nikumaroro 12 times. They have come up with all manner of flotsam and jetsam because many people lived on Nikumaroro over the years, since 1938, when or 1939, I believe, Gilbertese settlers started to be moved there. Then in the 40s, we had a Coast Guard Loran station there during the war years, and then more settlers lived there until the early 60s. Hundreds of people have lived on the island. Hundreds of people make lots of garbage, and when you go there and you dig, you're going to find some of it. So this is what happened over the 12 times that Gillespie and his people went there. Over the years since 1989, and they came back. They always find something that they claim is that they try to tie to Earhart and Noonan. Once was a navigator's bookcase. That was the big one in the early 90s. That was on the cover of USA Today. They really got lots of lift from that one. Then they had later on they had a shoe sole that was a size 9. and that they claimed was Amelia's came from her shoe. Well, actually, she later on it was learned that she wore size 6. It couldn't have possibly been her shoe size. Then there's been so many different things. A piece of aluminum that he said came from another piece from the outside of the Electra. There was freckle cream. Just recently there were bones, or there were just this last July there were dogs. 4 cadaver dogs were let loose on Nikumaroro after how many years? 80 years. They were let loose on the island to look for her bones. They actually tried to get publicity by I mean, it goes beyond absurd now after all this time. But this is all the man on the street knows about Earhart. That's all they know. They know about TIGHAR and Gillespie. They don't know about anything else. Okay. Now, in 1999, this is important. I think your listeners would gain from this. I have a letter that Fred Gardner wrote to a guy named Ed Barnes, who was a high executive with Life magazine. And Gardner was writing to warn Burns about TIGHAR and Gillespie, and he laid it all out to Burns in a letter. And I'm going to read it. If it becomes too stiff, I'll stop reading. But I think that this is something that if your listeners are interested in learning the history of the TIGHAR scam, is all it is. It's a big scam. They've made millions of dollars from this. I believe most of the money that they've gotten have been from black ops, from government ops, under the table type stuff, to because nobody in their right mind, especially after the first time or two that they went to Nikumaroro, and it became clear that with any study at all that anyone could find that there's no basis for believing she was there when you have all of this that has been done by so many people that put her on Saipan. But anyway, here is some of what Fred Gardner wrote to Ed Barnes of Life magazine. This is 1991. This is right before the big Life magazine spread that came out that had Gillespie and TIGHAR in there. Made their big splash. Right, I think it was right on the heels of CNN or right before CNN. I don't remember exactly. But anyway, I'm quoting now. Dear Mr. Barnes, it is with some trepidation that I provide this information to you. I stand behind the evidence I'm presenting to you, but I make it clear that I prefer not to be brought into what I consider to be the bogus claims of Dr. Gillespie. He called him doctor at the time. I don't know where he got that idea. He's not a doctor. Anyway, Mrs. Thrasher, who is Gillespie's wife, and the organization known as TIGHAR. You may use my name only if absolutely needed for verisimilitude. I'm quoting now from the letter. First, I believe it is important for you to know that the Mccain and Gardner Islands theory is not the property of or the result of the work of Gillespie and TIGHAR. The work is a result of the efforts of Professor Frederick Hooven of the Thayer School of Engineering at Dartmouth College. Hooven conducted a series of computer studies on the Earhart matter of Dartmouth, and I urged him in 1982 to write a paper regarding his conclusions that I might present at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. At the time, I was participating in an Earhart symposium at NASM in 1982. Okay, now the name of that paper was The Last Flight, or Amelia Earhart's Last Flight. Professor Hooven prepared the paper, and I presented it to Miss Claudia Oakes, who was then associate curator at NSAM. A copy of Hooven's work is herewith attached. I should here inform you that Frederick Hooven, among many, many impressive accomplishments, was the inventor of a low-frequency air direction finder that was used for several decades aboard commercial and military aircraft. Hooven and then U.S. Army Air Corps allowed one of those direction finders to be installed aboard Earhart's plane, and Hooven met directly with Amelia Earhart. Because of pressures from her friend Eugene Vidal and a division of Bendix Radio, Earhart removed the Hooven device and replaced it with an older high-frequency direction finding device then used by the U.S. Navy. As you will note, Professor Hooven's 1982 conclusions have been taken without attribution by TIGHAR. The very odd thing is that Hooven reached the conclusion before his death in 1985 that neither Gardner, Nikumaroro, or Mccain could have been the landing places of the Earhart plane. His thinking was based upon a thorough research we conducted regarding the histories of both of these islands. The initial Hooven research reached Gillespie and TIGHAR in this manner. A gentleman named Hardin McDonald Wade, Jr. of Atlanta, Georgia, became deeply interested in the Earhart mystery. He contacted me and learned about the Hooven paper. I wrote to Claudia Oakes on his behalf, and he was given a copy of Hooven's work. Okay, so he says, shortly thereafter, Mr. Wade began to try to raise funds for an expedition to Mccain and Gardner Islands. He, too, presented the Hooven material without attribution. Then he goes on to say Hooven, or Hardin McDonald Wade, met a guy named Tom Willie, and then Willie met a guy named Tom Gannon, and they are the ones that eventually presented this information to Gillespie. So Gillespie's Nikumaroro hypothesis, I'm not quoting now anymore from the letter, it's basically a third-hand idea that was rejected by Hooven. Back to the letter, he said, we had personally contacted the three pilots from USS Colorado who had overflown Mccain and Gardner Island in July 1937, 1 week after the Earhart disappearance. No sign of life or wreckage was seen on either of the tiny islands. Captain John Lembrecht, who was the senior Navy aviator aboard Colorado and overflew both Mccain and Gardner Island, that's Nikumaroro, 1 week after the disappearance, sent me his reports, and they indicated signs of recent habitation had been observed on Gardner. Captain Lembrecht told me the signs of recent habitation were the crumbling walls of what appeared to have been buildings. That's all. Nothing to do with Earhart. Gillespie and TIGHAR have chosen to interpret signs of recent habitation, despite Lembrecht's explanation, as an Earhart survival camp. Okay, in October 1937, Henry Maude, the British and a British team of investigators from Australia, conducted a full investigation of the island. Nothing was found that was linked. That was actually 100 days after Earhart went missing. Henry Maude went to the island, went to Nikumaroro, found nothing at all. In 1938, a joint New Zealand and British team headed by E.A. Gibson, blah, 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 other people landed on Gardner, conducted a full survey. They surveyed for an airfield, and they cleared up obstructions in the lagoon. They found nothing. Also, in 1939, Henry Maude returned to Gardner with the first contingent of Gilbert Island settlers. Gardner then continually inhabited until 1964. A village was built on the island in the area which has been surveyed for the airfield. Thousands of coconut palms were planted. During all of this activity, nothing would connect Earhart and Noonan on the island was found, and nothing was reported. In 1939, the U.S. Navy ship USS Bushnell surveyed Gardner Island for U.S. defense purposes. This survey also included aerial photos and mosaics of the island. Nothing concerning Earhart and Noonan was found or reported. Also, not in the letter, or at least in this order in the letter, in 1928 or 1929, the British freighter, the SS Norwich City, which was a freighter, almost 6,000-ton freighter, crashed aground on the reef at Nikumaroro, and 11 men were killed. 11 men of the Norwich City were killed, and they were buried on Nikumaroro. Okay, this accounts for for one of the skeletons that was found and was later initially called a male skeleton, but then changed to a female later by Gillespie, who really doesn't have much respect for the facts. It just goes on and on.
That skeleton, I think, was later disappeared too, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, it did. It disappeared, so he could have more easily called it a female skeleton. It was when it was found in I'm not sure when it was found. Let me see here.
And I think maybe while you're looking for that, I can just also tie up a loop here in that one of the real reasons why Nikumaroro, formerly known as Gardner Island, and the Saipan theory in terms of the stuff that gets pulled out of the ground, one of the real contrasts there is, as you're mentioning, there was Westerners that had access to what was known as Gardner Island, currently Nikumaroro, during the time period that Earhart went missing, or at least shortly thereafter. Whereas with Saipan and that was these other islands were controlled by the Japanese, and so if we find Western artifacts from that same time period, they're a lot more significant, no, if they're found on Saipan than if they are on Nikumaroro. Is that would you agree with it? Yeah.
Yeah, but that connection that connection is way superseded by all the other facts that we have. I mean, getting back to Gardner's letter to this guy at Barnes of Life, Gardner writes a very coherent letter that is absolutely full of so many different facts about why she couldn't have been there and how she wasn't there. And then Life magazine turned around and still did this incredible story about Gillespie. It wasn't their cover story, because he's not on the cover of that. I think a photo of the planet Earth is on the cover, but it might as well be the cover story of the Life magazine. And also we have as a piece in that Life, in the 1991 Life story on Gillespie's goose chase on Nikumaroro, they have a little tiny sidebar called an opposing view in there, and it's from, I think, a guy named Ed Werner and Elgin Long. Actually, Elgin Long actually did go on record to oppose Gillespie, because of course Long had his own idea. But this says an opposing view. It says Richard Gillespie's bold claim that he has solved the Earhart mystery will not go unchallenged. If he is right, most other Earhart experts are wrong. Understandably disturbed, one expert, Elgin Long, asked a well-qualified aeronautical engineer to examine Gillespie's photographs and documents. Frank Schelling, head of the P-3 Aircraft Structures Branch at U.S. Navy Aviation Depot in Alameda, California, said this: Gillespie's case doesn't stand up after studying the Lockheed repair orders and inspecting a photograph of the aluminum fragment found on Nikumaroro. I examined the belly and other structures or surfaces of the Electra that was manufactured 1 year before Amelia Earhart's. During the year, no structural changes were made. I saw no area of the aircraft where the fragment would fit. The fragment did not come from the Electra, and he goes on to explain why. Gardner closes his letter to Barnes. He says, I do not know what Gillespie will do when he does not find a plane at Gardner on the current visit there. Now, he's only talking about the second visit that he was making to the island. This is 1991. Gardner writes, will he dig up some pitiful remains? There are plenty there. Polynesians, Gilbertese, Gallagher are buried there, and maybe more. He does not have permission to invade those graves, but he must bring something back. Knowing what I do about the past gambits of Gillespie and TIGHAR, I would not put anything past him. Capital letters, anything. Certainly he will come back with more bits of metal, or perhaps the soles of some shoes, which may have belonged to Noonan. It is not beyond my belief that Gillespie will attempt to salt the mine in some way. It was really coincidental that Gardner mentioned soles of shoes, because that's exactly what he did later on. He actually came back with the soles of shoes that he called them the Earhart shoes, size 9s, which later were shown to be size 6s, and that she wore size 6. Let's see what else. He said. I'm back to Gardner again. He says, it should be obvious to you that I have no vested interest in any of this. My book, The Search for Amelia Earhart, has been out of print since 1970, and I have not attempted to insinuate my name into the media where the subject is concerned since that time. I have answered questions posed to me by members of the media, and I will continue to do so. For instance, I am providing the same material to my friend Bill German, who is executive editor of the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper. It is possible that one day I will write another book which details the incredible array of characters who have struggled to make capital of the Earhart disappearance in the last 20 years, including the yo-yos who have tried to claim that she was, until 1984, alive and well and living in New Jersey. Wow, Barnum lives. He's talking about the Bolam thing there.
Right.
Gardner is. Gardner was running out of gas. By 1991, Gardner was just running out of gas. He had already been diagnosed with cancer, and he died in 1994. So he wasn't nearly as enthusiastic or as energetic in pursuing the truth in the Earhart case. He was able to write a letter to Ed Barnes of Life to lay it all out, to warn him about all this. But that's it, and Life just ignored him, and they had their own agenda from the start. So that's basically the name of that tune. I also have a section in my book, Amelia Earhart, The Truth at Last. There's a few pages that I spend in there with the TIGHAR lies,
Right.
but I try not to spend any more time than I really need to do, because it just doesn't merit that.
Yeah, and if anybody wants to investigate further, definitely check out Earhart Truth and maybe just type in some search term like Gardner letter or something like that, and I'm sure you can find it.
Or Gardner Island, Nikumaroro,
Yeah.
Gillespie, Hooven. All of those terms will bring you to all kind of information, more than you really are ready to sit down and read at one sitting.
Yeah.
I have over 134 posts, I think, now. These are not small posts. The posts on my blog are thousands of words long, some more than 5,000 words long. Each post is its own little, it's like a story. It's like an article.
Right, and I just also wanted to point out that episode with cadaver dogs, which a lot of this really does take on the air of performance art once you sort of know what's behind the Nikumaroro theory, was covered in National Geographic, the Daily Mail, lots of other news organizations wrote about that, even though it was totally flogging a dead horse at that point. And I speaking of recent articles on your blog, and there's been a number of good ones. There's the first part in a series about Japanese war crimes, but also you recently covered a history documentary that came out this year called Amelia Earhart, The Lost Evidence, that was put out by a company called Morningstar Entertainment and basically centered on a photo that was recently discovered, supposedly, that is alleged to depict Amelia Earhart. And I wonder if we couldn't talk a little bit about that theory. What's your thoughts on whether or not that has any validity to it?
Okay, Leo, this is the thing that some of your readers may be well aware of. This History Channel presentation that was done July 9th of this year on the History Channel. It was really built up. It was NBC began the blitz on July 5 on their morning news. They showed a photograph that they claimed could possibly be a photograph of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan on the dock at Jalowit. They made a big deal out of this. I was aware of this going on for about a year prior. For about a year prior, I'd been talking to Morningstar about, I knew that this program was coming up on the 9th. I didn't know all the details about exactly how they were going to present it all during that year. But I spoke with the Morningstar chief, Gary Tarpinian, at least twice, but I think 3 times, for over 2 hours. I talked to his producers for several more hours. They led me to believe that I was going to be interviewed on that program, and that they were going to feature me on that program, whereas in retrospect now, of course, they never had any intention of putting me on the program. This Morningstar production on the History Channel is an example of the absolute worst sort of disinformation that the establishment will put out in order to discredit the truth of the Marshall Islands and the Saipan presence of Earhart and Noonan. This big publicity blitz that began on the 5th of July by NBC News, as soon as that thing went off the air, I began writing, and I wrote the first of several posts on this. The first post was, since I hadn't seen the program yet, it was the 5th. The first post was headlined, Earhart special to feature bogus photo claims. Okay? Because the photo is clearly not of anyone that's identifiable as Earhart and Noonan. Now, the people that they claim are Earhart and Noonan in the photo may well be, may possibly, one of them might be her, although there's no way to actually tell if it's a male or a female. So the people that are in favor of this idea, they're making the giant leap of faith that because one of the researchers the researcher that found the photo, named Les Kinney 4 years ago or 5 years ago in the archives, unclassified archives, he claims that it had to be them because there weren't any other white people on Jalawut at the time. Well, you can't even tell the people are white to begin with. He's making that assumption. Secondly, you cannot make the assumption that because people are supposed to be the only white people on the island, that this photo that depicts people that can't be made out has to be them. It's one absurd assumption after the next. Okay, so and then we get into the other media. There was, as soon as almost within 2 days of NBC and Fox and other networks getting out there and showing this photo with Les Kinney and Gary Tarpinian claiming that this is Earhart and Noonan, and therefore because this is Earhart and Noonan that they were in the Marshalls and Saipan. What they did was, this was all a setup, okay? This was a setup by Morningstar because what they really wanted to do was to attack the truth and discredit the truth. If they would have presented legitimate information on the History Channel up front and from the start and forgot about this stupid photo that's inconclusive at best. At best, it's inconclusive, totally inconclusive. Then they would have actually been putting out some legitimate information that people could have taken and used. However, that wasn't what they wanted to do, nor was that ever their purpose. Their purpose was to discredit the truth. So what they did was they made such a big fuss about the photo and the photo showing the flyers, and they pegged everything in the program onto that. And the program was really, they actually did show some legitimate information, bits and pieces here and there. They showed Bilamon Amaron, a rare clip of him. They showed Joaquina Cabrera, who was an eyewitness, interviewed by Gardner and also by Cathera. They showed photos of her. They showed they showed a few other things that were legitimate pieces of information that have never been shown on TV. However, what happened was alleged Japanese blogger comes out 2 days after NBC makes a big fuss. He comes out and says, this photo was taken in 1935, and I have a copy of it on my travel log, on some sort of a travel log. And since this photo was taken in 1935, it couldn't possibly be them. All the media then took that claim by the blogger and put that up on their sites and said they have debunked this idea has been debunked. So therefore, even before the History Channel's July 9th presentation of the alleged photo in their claims went live on the air, it had already been debunked. It had already been debunked. I believe all of this was planned beforehand. And so in my review, which I wrote a lengthy 3,000-plus word review on my blog, I invite readers to come and read it. I can get into all the details sequentially and logically there, whereas when I'm talking, I'm just rambling, and I don't speak half as well as I write. So please go read my review. It's called history's Earhart special is an underhanded attack on the truth, and that's exactly what it is, an underhanded attack on the truth. I had there's other things been written about this by Dave Martin, who was a brilliant pundit who has his own blog, his own website, dcdave.com, who writes about the passing scene and better than anybody alive right now, in my opinion, and is very, very honest. He writes and he also wrote 2 reviews of the book, the first edition and the second edition, and so he wrote in support of this as well, and he agreed with me totally, adding some more information. This was nothing less than a blatant, deceitful disinformation drill. And on top of all this, after the Japanese bloggers' claims came out, the Marshall Islands issued their statement, which debunked the debunker. They issued a statement saying that the photo, that the dock was actually built in 1936, not 1935. Therefore, the Japanese blogger's claim is false, and that it's possible that this photo could have been of Earhart and Noonan. They don't say that it is or it isn't. They just say that the photo was taken in
the dock was built.
Was built in 1936. This statement from the Marshall Islands was not picked up by anybody in the media. Only Gillespie picked it up from TIGHAR, and another blogger named Rich Martini picked up this statement. I'm sure everybody in the media had it. They weren't interested in it. The deed had been done, the drill had been run, the truth had been discredited, and that was the end of the story as far as the media was concerned. Nobody in the media followed up on any of the other information that was presented by the History Channel, in addition to the stupid photo. All the legitimate information was completely ignored and discredited because the photo was discredited. Therefore, their convoluted logic tells them all the other information has to be false as well. This is how disinformation works, and this is how it works in the media. This was really a blatant example. Meanwhile, readers and listeners were flocking to my blog. I had the highest blog visits of all time on my blog, and during July we sold more books than we ever sold in any month since 2012 in the first edition, because people were driven by interest by the History Channel to find out. They were so confused and disoriented and interested also, and they found the truth the only place they could find it, on my blog and in my book.
Yeah, it really, especially when you see it laid out in a blog post, in a timeline, it really does smack of a disinfo campaign, especially the way things were orchestrated and the time periods in between. The photo, just to give listeners a little bit of a visual description.
You can take that photo and you can put it on your blog if you're interested. It's available. For
sure, and I'm just looking at it right now, and it just depicts the corner of a dock and a number of ships, and in the background of the photo, behind a row of standing people, there's a squatting figure that's maybe only a handful of pixels tall, very small within the context of the photo, and that's supposed to be Amelia Earhart. And to the left of the line of standing people, there's a man leaning on something, and that, and these, even with magnification, these figures are very hard to even make out. And so
you have to really zoom in to get any look at it at all.
And and I've watched parts of that documentary that was on history, and the way that they analyze it again it's almost like performance art, and they have some guy who's like a photo expert in photogrammetry or some weird discipline like that, where he's talking about Noonan's hairline and all this other stuff. It's pretty ridiculous.
It's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. And he says, I give it 99.7% probability that it's just sort of sanctimonious nonsense. And so much of the History Channel's program is just wasted time and performance art, as you say. It's all pretentiousness. It's just, they have this investigative team, and it shows 4 of them walking together. It's almost like the gunfight at the OK Corral, man. These guys are going to go and they're going to find the truth about the Earhart disappearance. I mean, it is, as I say in my blog, it is too pretentious for words.
Yeah. And I'll definitely put links in the show notes to those DC Dave pieces because they are really great supplementary material. As you mentioned, DC Dave's website is dcdave.com. There's so many other things that we could touch on, but maybe we'll leave them to another episode. Definitely would again suggest people check out the blog. Real quick question: any timeline on when the next part of the Japanese war crimes piece is going to be out? Any comment?
Yes, probably soon. Probably. Normally I do it. I'd like to have a new blog every 2 weeks, but I've been running out of material. I mean, there is a finite amount of material on. So part 2 is coming soon, probably midweek, coming up.
Right,
yes.
and that's a really good, interesting macro perspective because it illuminates a little bit about what was going on in the Pacific in the interwar period, and especially in the late 30s, which is the time period in question, and how the Japanese were operating. And so I think it's important historical context for people that want to know what happened with Amelia Earhart. So I think we'll leave it there, and again, I'll put links in the show notes to stuff like earharttruth.com and Mike's book on Amazon, which is again Amelia Earhart: The Truth at Last. Lots of great photos and other resources there. So thanks a lot, Mike. I really appreciate it.
I'd like to just read one thing.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I totally missed that in my notes.
No problem.
Mike has a paragraph that he wants to just kind of summarize things at the end of the episode here, which I think is a great way to wind up.
Yeah, I just like to close by saying to your listeners, the disappearance of Amelia Earhart is not an insipid piece of American historical trivia, an unimportant subject for idle academic discussion and speculation that in the end defies solution. This is a major event in our history that has been so distorted and misrepresented by our government and establishment media that the American people think it's an irresolvable mystery. Without some incredible, unforeseen change, the status quo in the Earhart case will never change. Please help dispel the darkness and support this cause in whatever ways you can. And I'm sure your listeners can imagine what I mean by how they can support the cause. Thank you so much, Leo.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate your time.